Every letter you have ever read, every word you have ever written, traces back to a single invention. Not to Greece, not to Rome, to a people who lived on a narrow strip of rocky coast in what is now Lebanon, hemmed between the mountains and the sea, who needed a faster way to keep records across a vast network of ships and trading ports. 22 characters, no vowels. Simple enough for a merchant to learn in a season. From those 22 marks, every alphabet in the Western world descended. Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and every language that grew from them. The people who made it called themselves by the names of their cities. Everyone else called them Phoenicians. One of their colonies would grow into the wealthiest city on earth. It would pioneer maritime insurance, interest-bearing trade loans, during a commercial empire that stretched from Lebanon to the Atlantic coast of Africa, not held together by armies, but by law, trust, and the movement of ships. Rome would need 3 wars across 100 years and the deliberate destruction of every book, every archive, and every stone to bring it down. What follows is the story of that city and of everything the world lost when it burned. The eastern shore of the Mediterranean ends at a wall. The mountains of Lebanon rise almost directly from the sea. A sheer spine of limestone and cedar running the full length of the coast, snow-capped in winter, cutting off the narrow coastal strip from everything behind it. The cities that grew there had no room to expand inland. They had only the sea, where 3 of these cities would become the most consequential trading ports the ancient world had ever known. Byblos was the oldest, a settlement already thousands of years deep by the time the first millennium began, its stones layered with the residue of every civilization that had passed through. Sidon sat to the south, perched on twin natural harbors protected by a chain of small islands and reefs. And further south still, built on a small island just off the rocky coast, was Tyre, sealed off from the mainland by a narrow stretch of open water, approachable only by boat, and therefore nearly impossible to take by force. These were not a unified nation. The people of Tyre did not think of themselves as the same people as the people of Sidon. Each city had its own king, its own dialect, its own priestly hierarchy, its own laws. They competed with each other as often as they cooperated. The Greeks would later lump them all together under a single name, Phoenician, but that name meant nothing to the people it described. They were Tyrians, Sidonians, Byblians. They were people of a particular harbor, a particular temple, a particular god. What bound them was not a shared identity, but a shared condition. Pinned between the mountains and the sea, with almost no agricultural land to speak of, every one of these cities faced the same fundamental problem. They could not feed themselves from the earth beneath their feet. To survive, they had to trade. To trade, they had to sail. And to sail, they had to build ships better than anyone else. The timber for those ships grew directly above them, on the slopes of the mountains they could not farm. And the cedars of Lebanon were the finest shipbuilding wood in the ancient world, lightweight, resistant to rot, and available in lengths that could span the keel of a serious ocean-going vessel. The Egyptians had been buying this timber from the people of Byblos since at least 3200 BC. When the Phoenicians cut a cedar from the mountain and floated it down to their yards, they were working in a tradition already ancient before any of the great Greek city-states had been founded. Their ships were built to last and built to carry. The hull planks were locked together using a joinery technique of mortises and tenons, pockets cut into adjacent planks that interlocked and were pinned with wooden pegs, creating a bond that the sea could not work loose. It was a construction method so effective that when the Greeks and Romans eventually adopted it, Roman writers specifically called it Punic joinery, preserving in the name of a technique the memory of the people who invented it. What these ships carried in those earliest centuries was color. The coastline around Tyre was thick with murex snails, predatory sea creatures that produced in the gland beneath their shell a small quantity of fluid that was unlike anything else in the natural world. When exposed to sunlight, that fluid turned purple, a deep, saturated crimson purple that did not fade. In fact, it intensified with age and light. It was a color found nowhere else in the ancient world, and the Phoenicians discovered how to extract it and fix it permanently into cloth. The process was slow and appalling. Workers cracked the shells and extracted the glands by hand, dumping them into great lead vats filled with brine. The vats were heated for 10 days over low fires. The smell that rose from them was almost unendurable, a stench of rotting sea life that clung to the workers and to the streets and to the surrounding air for long distances. The Egyptian papyrus of Anastasia described the hands of a dyer as reeking like rotting fish. The Talmud would eventually grant women the right to divorce a husband who became a dyer after marriage. To produce a single gram of dye required somewhere between 10 and 12,000 snails. The hem of a single garment dyed in full Tyrian purple required the cracking and boiling of tens of thousands of shellfish. The mounds of discarded murex shells at Sidon grew, over centuries, to 40 meters in height. The species was hunted to near extinction along the Phoenician coast, and the color they produced was worth more than its weight in gold. The moment Tyrian purple appeared on the body of a king or a priest, it announced something that required no translation across language or culture. It said, "This person is above you." The dye became the color of Assyrian kings, of Egyptian high priests, of Roman emperors. It was called imperial purple, and then royal purple, and it would color the robes of Byzantine emperors for 1,000 years after the city that invented it had been ground to dust. When Roman senators were granted the right to wear a purple stripe on their toga, they were wearing the most direct possible inheritance of a Phoenician dye works on the coast of Lebanon. And the city of Tyre carried this industry so deeply into its identity that the Greeks named them after it. Phoenike, the purple people, or perhaps the crimson land. The exact etymology remains uncertain, but the connection is unmistakable. A civilization whose identity, in Greek eyes, was inseparable from the color that had made them rich. Their gods reflected the world they lived in. Each city had its chief deity and its private pantheon, but certain figures moved across all of them. Astarte was everywhere, goddess of love, fertility, and war, depicted with a crescent on her head, her temples served by priestesses whose functions were as much sacred as they were worldly. Kings and queens of Sidon called themselves her priests. In Tyre, Astarte was paired with Melkart, whose name meant simply, in Phoenician, king of the city. Melkart was the patron of Tyre and of everything Tyre touched. He was depicted as a bearded figure carrying an ankh in one hand and a fenestrated axe in the other. Life and death held simultaneously. Each year, the city performed a great ceremony for him called the ERASED, the Awakening, which celebrated his return from the underworld. The high priest of Melkart held the second highest office in the city, ranking directly behind the king, and his wealth was a reflection of the city's. Temples to Melkart followed Tyrian traders wherever they settled, serving not only as places of worship, but as institutional guarantors of commercial contracts, sanctified spaces where deals were struck and the god himself was invoked as witness. Byblos, the oldest of the three great cities, had given the world something that would prove more durable than any temple or harbor. Its name had already become attached to the papyrus trade that flowed through it, Byblos being the Greek word for papyrus, and the source, in time, of the word Bible. The city sat atop a hill of accumulated history so deep that its layers of stone contained Neolithic settlements beneath Bronze Age temples, beneath Iron Age walls, each civilization building on the rubble of the last. When Phoenician sailors left Byblos for the open sea, they were departing from one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth, carrying with them a tradition of trade and seamanship already 4,000 years old. Before the Phoenicians, writing was a technology of the powerful. The cuneiform script of Mesopotamia pressed meaning into clay using wedge-shaped marks, a system that ran to nearly 1,000 distinct signs, requiring years of dedicated training to master. Only scribes who had spent their entire professional lives in the service of temples and palaces could read or write with any fluency. The same was true in Egypt, where hieroglyphics interwove hundreds of symbols in combinations that demanded an entire priestly class to interpret. Writing, in both cases, was not a tool available to ordinary people. It was a mechanism of institutional control, and it was controlled by institutions. The Phoenician merchants had no interest in systems that took years to learn. They were moving goods across hundreds of kilometers of sea, negotiating contracts in ports where their ships stopped for a single night, to keeping records of debts and deliveries that had to be legible to a clerk on a dock as well as a counting house in Tyre. What they needed was something fast, transferable, and simple enough to teach a junior partner before a voyage. They took the existing symbols of their Canaanite scribal tradition, themselves partly derived from Egyptian hieroglyphs, abstracted and simplified over generations, and stripped the entire system down to its working parts. 22 letters, each one representing a single consonant sound. The shapes were angular and clean, designed to be cut quickly into stone or scratched rapidly onto a wax tablet or papyrus sheet. Vowels were left out entirely. The reader was expected to know the language and could supply them from context, exactly as a modern reader can parse a text message with missing letters. The letter for B was named Bet, the Phoenician word for house, and its shape was a rough sketch of a house with a pointed roof. The letter for A was Aleph, their word for ox, and the symbol was the angular head of an ox, 2 horns on a triangular skull. Every letter carried its meaning in its name, giving the learner a memory hook for each sound. A sailor with no prior education could become functionally literate in a matter of weeks. The Akkadian scribal system had required close to 1,000 signs to say what 22 now said just as clearly. For the first time in history, literacy was not the exclusive property of a priestly class. It belonged to anyone who worked in trade, which, along the Phoenician coast, meant nearly everyone. The children of merchants learned the letters before they learned the sea, girls as well as boys. As account keepers and ship captains, the alphabet moved through Phoenician society the way a practical tool always moves, wherever it was useful, which was nearly everywhere. The Greeks encountered the Phoenician alphabet somewhere around the 9th or 10th century BC, almost certainly through the trading contact that was now bringing Phoenician ships into the harbors of the Aegean on a regular basis. They recognized immediately what they had. The letter names the Greeks adopted were Semitic words with no meaning in Greek at all. Alpha, derived from aleph, ox, beta, from bet, house. The Greeks kept the Phoenician sequence, the Phoenician shapes, and the Phoenician logic of the system. They made one crucial modification. They took the consonant letters that represented sounds Greek did not have and repurposed them as vowels, producing the first fully voweled alphabet the world had ever seen. From that Greek alphabet, the Etruscan script developed. From Etruscan, Latin. From Latin, the script you are reading now. The oldest surviving piece of writing in the Phoenician script was found carved onto the lid of a stone sarcophagus at Byblos, the burial inscription of a king named Ahiram, dating to around the 11th century BC. It is not poetry or history. It is a curse, written by a king's son to protect his father's burial from robbers. Whoever opens this and disturbs the rest of the dead shall find no seat among the living. The first surviving document in the world's most consequential writing system was a threat scratched onto a coffin lid. Somehow that seems fitting. The same practical energy that produced the alphabet drove the Phoenicians out into the sea. Their ships were already the most sophisticated in the eastern Mediterranean, hulls built using the interlocking mortise and tenon joinery that gave them exceptional structural strength, decked over to keep cargo dry in open water, fitted with both sail and oar so they could move in any weather. The Egyptians had called their deep-water trading vessels Byblos ships, after the city that first built them, for as long as anyone could remember. Open water sailing at night required something no chart could provide: a fixed point in the sky to navigate by. The Phoenicians found it in the star that sits almost directly over the Earth's northern rotational pole. While every other star in the sky traces an arc through the night as the Earth turns, none the pole star holds still. The Greeks would come to call it Phoinike, the Phoenician star, because it was the Phoenicians who first systematically used it for navigation at sea. By holding a course relative to that fixed point, a sailor could maintain direction across open water far from any coast, sailing through darkness with a precision that no other Mediterranean people had yet achieved. Armed with this knowledge, the Phoenicians began pushing their voyages steadily westward. By the 10th century BC, they had established a trading post on Cyprus, exploiting the island's copper deposits and using it as a staging point for longer passages. From Cyprus, they moved to Sardinia, the Mediterranean's second-largest island, where copper, iron, silver, and lead lay in concentrations that made it one of the most valuable pieces of territory in the ancient world. On Sardinia, they set up smelting operations on an industrial scale, reducing ore into standardized ingots that could be loaded onto ships and transported east to satisfy the appetites of empires. From Sardinia, the voyages continued west. Phoenician sailors reached the North African coast and established a small trading post at a place called Utica, well positioned on a natural harbor where ships could stop and resupply before the open water crossing to the western Mediterranean. Then, they pushed through into the far west of the sea and found what they were looking for on a scale that must have been almost unimaginable. The southern coast of what is now Spain was essentially an open storehouse of silver, iron, tin, and copper. So enormous furnaces were built there to process the ore. The metals were cast into ingots and loaded onto ships that returned east. The wealth flowing into Tyre from the Spanish mines alone was enough to transform the city. But the Phoenicians did not stop at the western end of the sea. They passed through the Pillars of Hercules, the narrow gap between Europe and Africa that opens onto the Atlantic, and continued down the Moroccan coast, establishing a settlement at Lixus, near what is now the Moroccan city of Larache, and pushing further south to a port that would eventually become Essaouira, more than 4,000 kilometers from their homeland. These were not exploratory voyages in any casual sense. They were funded expeditions with specific commercial goals, backed by the accumulated capital of Tyre's merchant families. The financial infrastructure behind these voyages was itself a kind of innovation. Phoenician trading houses, usually run by a single family across multiple generations, pioneered the use of interest-bearing loans to fund individual voyages. A merchant who lacked the capital to outfit a ship could borrow it, with the voyage itself serving as collateral. If the ship returned safely with its cargo, the loan was repaid with interest. If the ship was lost at sea, the debt died with it. This was maritime insurance in its earliest recognizable form, and it allowed Phoenician merchants to take on commercial risks that would otherwise have been ruinous, spreading capital further and underwriting voyages that no single investor could afford alone. The network that emerged from all of this was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. And it was not an empire in any conventional sense. There was no army enforcing its edges, no central government issuing commands, no tax collectors marching from port to port. It was held together by shared commercial interest, a common writing system, recognizable religious institutions at every major port, and the quiet authority of reputation. A Tyrian merchant's word carried weight in a harbor in Spain because the Temple of Melkart in that harbor guaranteed it. The alphabet made contracts legible across every port in the network. The system ran itself. And running beneath all of it, carrying it from one end of the known world to the other, were the ships. By the 8th century BC, Phoenician vessels were a regular sight in every major harbor from the Levant to the Atlantic. Their captains knew the coasts of Africa and Spain the way a man knows the streets of his own city. They knew where the currents ran and where the anchorages were, which headlands generated dangerous crosswinds and which bays offered calm in a storm. This knowledge was their most valuable possession, and they kept it as carefully as any cargo. They wrote almost nothing down about their routes. What they knew, they taught in private, from father to son, captain to mate, on the water, under sail, moving west. The story of how Carthage came to be is a story that the city told about itself for generations. It begins not in Africa, but in Tyre, in a palace dispute of the kind that toppled dynasties across the ancient world. The king of Tyre had promised that on his death, his kingdom would be divided equally between his 2 children, his son Pygmalion and his daughter Elissa. When the old king died, Pygmalion broke the promise. He seized everything, sent his sister nothing, and had her husband murdered to remove any rival claim on power. The treasure that had belonged to Elissa's husband, he took for himself, or tried to. The legend says the ghost of the murdered man appeared to Elissa in the night and told her where the real gold was hidden, and told her to run. She gathered what she could, a small band of palace loyalists, a company of priests and temple women devoted to the goddess Astarte, and the hidden gold. She moved quickly to the docks, loaded her people onto ships, and slipped away from the harbor at night. Her brother's men would follow. To slow them, she loaded chests of sand onto the decks in the dark, bundled in cloth to look like treasure. When Pygmalion's men drew close enough to board, the chests were thrown into the sea. The pursuers stopped to recover what they believed was their king's gold. Elissa kept sailing west. Her first stop was Cyprus, the great copper island in the eastern Mediterranean. There, she took on a priest of Astarte and his family, with a promise that the priesthood of any temple she built would belong to his line in perpetuity. She also took on board a group of young women from a temple on the island, 80 of them, recruited or conscripted into the company of refugees. They would become the mothers of the next generation. Then the fleet turned southwest, toward Africa, toward a shore where Phoenician ships had touched but never settled. If they made land on a peninsula jutting into what is now called the Gulf of Tunis, the local Berber chieftain who controlled the territory was a king named Byblos. He received the newcomers cautiously and agreed to sell them land, but only as much land as could be enclosed by a single ox hide. It was a deliberately insulting offer. The hide of one ox would barely shelter a campfire. Elissa accepted the terms, then asked her people for a knife. She cut the hide into strips so thin they were barely visible, and laid them end to end in a line that curved around the entire hilltop overlooking the harbor. Byblos had promised her the land the hide could cover. She had made the hide cover a hill. He was bound by his word. The hill was called Bursa. It would become the citadel at the heart of the greatest city in the ancient Mediterranean. The word itself may come from the Phoenician bra, meaning fortress, or from the Semitic bastra, meaning steep slope, though later Greeks, finding the story irresistible, chose to believe it derived from their own word for ox hide. In either case, the name stuck, and the hill and the trick attached to it became the founding story a city told to explain what it was. Clever, resourceful, quick-minded, unafraid to operate by rules no one else had thought of yet. Before the first buildings were laid, the ground was dug for foundations. Workers broke open the earth and found, in the first pit they sank, the skull of an ox, an omen, in Phoenician belief, of wealth accompanied by servitude, a city that would prosper but labor under others. The site was abandoned and the digging moved. The second pit produced the skull of a horse. In Phoenician culture, The horse was an emblem of courage and martial power, the animal of warriors and conquerors. The city would be built here. Its symbol, from the earliest coins to the last, would be the horse. The traditional date for the founding is around 814 BC, although the earliest physical traces of settlement on the site belong to the late 8th century. The gap is small enough that the founding tradition is probably not invention. What the ground below the later city contains is evidence of a community that grew with remarkable speed from the moment it appeared, expanding outward from the shore, laying down streets, cutting graves into the red earth, building workshops for dyeing cloth within a generation of the first arrivals. The name the founders gave their city was Carthage. In Phoenician, Ekort meant city, and Hadasht meant new. They called it simply the New City, a name that distinguished it from older Phoenician settlements along the same coast, particularly from Utica, the established colony a short distance to the north that had been there for generations before Elissa's ships arrived. Utica had given the refugees what help it could at the beginning. Within a century, Carthage had grown large enough to cast a shadow over it. The geography of the site was almost absurdly well chosen. The peninsula sat at the dead center of the Gulf of Tunis, protected on three sides by sea or water, with the shallow lagoon of Lake Tunis forming a barrier to the south. The single landward approach was narrow, broken by hills, and easily fortified. Standing on the height of Bursa, you could see every ship that entered the bay hours before it reached the city. The open water to the north looked out over the Mediterranean, and from that northern shore, it was barely 200 kilometers by sea to the island of Sicily and barely 300 to Sardinia, two of the richest islands in the ancient world, both already woven into the Phoenician trading network. The land itself was fertile in a way that surprised people who expected Africa to be dry and difficult. The Majerta River, which rose in the Atlas Mountains to the southwest and ran 460 kilometers before emptying into the bay, brought silt and fresh water to a coastal plain that was capable of producing wheat, olives, grapes, and fruit in abundance. The city would need grain ships from overseas in its early decades, but the land around it was a long-term asset of enormous value. It would eventually feed not just the city, but a network of towns that spread across the interior of what is now northern Tunisia. The first structures were simple. Mud brick buildings along the waterfront, a wall perhaps 3 meters high around the earliest settlement, a cemetery cut into the slope below the hill. But within a century, metalworking workshops had replaced the first graveyard, which was moved to make room, and the city had already begun rebuilding itself in stone. Pottery found in the lowest levels of the site shows imports from Greece, Italy, and every corner of the Phoenician world, arriving almost from the beginning. Carthage was not a remote outpost slowly finding its footing. It was already, from its earliest years, a node in a network. It is a place where ships from every part of the Mediterranean touched. At the end of all of this, the flight from Tyre, the tricks and the treaties, the digging and the building, the legend says that Byblos the Berber king wanted more than the rent he was receiving for the land. He told Elissa he would destroy the city unless she married him. She asked for time to prepare the ceremony. She built a great pyre inside of the city and climbed it, telling her people she was going to join her murdered husband in the afterlife, rather than submit. She lit the fire herself. The people of Carthage gave her the name Dido after her death, meaning wanderer, or in some traditions, female warrior. It was this name that Virgil would use when he wrote her into one of the most famous love stories in Latin literature 6 centuries later. Whether or not any individual in the story was real, the myth carried a truth the city clearly recognized in itself. The founder was a woman who had survived betrayal, crossed the sea with nothing, outwitted a king with a strip of leather, and built an empire on a hill she had claimed by cleverness alone. She had died rather than surrender what she built. The story told the people of Carthage something about the kind of city they lived in, about its origins in exile and ingenuity, and about the price of its independence. It was a myth that served its purpose well, and the city would find itself living it again and again in the centuries to come. The horse's skull turned out to be the right omen. Within 2 centuries of that first landing, and the new city on the Tunisian shore had grown into the most powerful commercial civilization the Mediterranean had ever produced. Ships registered in its harbor traded from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the far shores of the Black Sea. Its treasury accumulated wealth that dwarfed those of the Greek city-states. Its navy commanded the Western Sea. The mud-brick settlement on the cliff above the bay had become Carthage, and there was nothing else in the world quite like it. The city that had grown from that first mud-brick settlement on the Tunisian shore was, by the 5th century BC, something the ancient world had never quite produced before. It was not a kingdom. It had no pharaoh, no divine ruler, no hereditary line of kings whose legitimacy rested on blood and the favor of gods. It was a republic, and a republic older than Rome's, older than Athens' democracy, and in some ways more stable than either. The 2 most powerful offices in Carthage were called the suffets. The word meant judges, drawn from the same Semitic root as the Hebrew shofet. 2 of them were elected each year by the citizens, served their single term, and then stepped down. No suffet held power for life. No suffet could pass his office to his son. The office returned to the people at the end of every year without exception. Below the suffetes sat the council of elders, the adirim, the mighty ones, drawn from the wealthiest families in the city and serving for life. They advised the suffetes, oversaw foreign policy and financial matters, and debated the great questions of war and diplomacy in the Senate House that stood in the marketplace at the foot of the Bursa Hill. When the suffetes and the council agreed, no further debate was needed. When they disagreed, the matter went to a popular assembly of citizens who cast the deciding vote. The system was imperfect, prone to the corruption of wealth, slow at times, and occasionally paralyzed by faction, but it produced a city that ran without a tyrant for 600 years. The Greek philosopher Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC, compared the Carthaginian constitution favorably to that of Sparta, the system he most admired among his neighbors. He praised its mixed character, its balance between the authority of magistrates, the weight of the Senate, and the check provided by popular opinion. He noted that Carthage had produced neither civil war of any significance nor a tyrant in all of its recorded history. For a Greek philosopher surveying the wreckage of cities repeatedly torn apart by factional violence and strongman rule, this was remarkable. He also noted its flaw with equal precision. The Carthaginians placed too much value on wealth as a qualification for office, which opened the door to corruption. Men who bought their way into power, he observed, would find ways to profit from it. Alongside the suffetes and the council sat a third body that had no equivalent elsewhere in the ancient world. It was called the Tribunal of the 104. Its members were drawn from the senatorial class and held office for life. Its primary function was to hold generals and other senior officials to account after their terms ended. A general who won his campaign returned home to face the tribunal and explain every decision he had made. A general who lost faced it under far more hostile conditions. The tribunal held the power to impose fines, to strip a man of his citizenship, and in cases of catastrophic failure or suspected treachery, to order the ultimate penalty. It was, in effect, an institutional check on military ambition, a mechanism designed to ensure that no successful general could use his army's loyalty to seize power at home. This separation between civilian and military authority was one of the most distinctive features of the Carthaginian system. In Rome, and the same man who commanded armies in the field also held political power at home. The consulship combined both functions. In Carthage, they were kept deliberately apart. The general served for the duration of his campaign. The suffet managed the city. When the campaign was over, the general came home, laid down his command, and answered to the tribunal. The system created real tensions. Generals in the field sometimes found themselves starved of resources by a Senate that wanted the war to end, and the threat of the tribunal hung over every decision. But it kept the army out of politics in a way that Rome never quite managed. The men who held all of these positions, suffets, senators, members of the tribunal, drew no salary for their service. Public office in Carthage carried no wage. This had a predictable consequence. It meant that only men wealthy enough to support themselves without income could realistically hold high positions, which concentrated power firmly among the merchant and landowning families of the city. But it also had a less obvious effect. Because these men were not paid by the state, they were not dependent on the state. Their wealth came from their trading houses, their farming estates, their shares in commercial voyages. The city could not buy their loyalty or starve them into submission by withholding a salary. They were, within limits, genuinely independent of the government they served. The engine beneath all of this political architecture was commerce, and the commercial organization of Carthage was as sophisticated as its constitution. The city's economic life was dominated by great merchant families, houses that combined the functions of a trading firm, a bank, and a shipping company under one family name. These houses maintained permanent agents in the major ports of the Mediterranean, managed long-term relationships with suppliers and buyers across dozens of markets, and controlled the movement of goods across the Western Sea. Their records were kept in the Phoenician script, their contracts enforced partly by law and partly by the institutional authority of the city's temples, where agreements were witnessed by the gods themselves. To fund the voyages on which all of this depended, these houses developed financial instruments of considerable sophistication. A merchant who needed capital to outfit a ship could borrow it from an investor under a specific form of contract. The investor advanced the money at a high rate of interest, reflecting the genuine risk involved. If the ship completed its voyage and returned with its cargo, the loan was repaid in full with interest, and both parties profited. If the ship was lost at sea, to storm, to pirates, to any cause beyond the merchant's control, the debt died with it. The investor absorbed the loss. This arrangement was not charity. It was a rational mechanism for distributing risk across multiple parties, so that no single disaster could destroy any single house. It was, in recognizable form, maritime insurance. These contracts were standardized and written down, among the first private commercial agreements in history to be fully committed to writing as a matter of routine. The terms were consistent enough across the Mediterranean that a merchant in Carthage and an investor in Tyre could enter into an agreement without negotiating every clause from scratch because both already knew what the clauses were. The Phoenician alphabet made this possible. Without a writing system simple enough for a merchant to use personally, these contracts would have remained the province of temple scribes. With it, they became the daily operating language of a commercial civilization. The goods that moved through this system were drawn from every corner of the world the Carthaginians had reached. Silver and tin came in from the mines of southern Spain, copper from Sardinia and Cyprus, iron from the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Amber arrived from the Baltic coast of northern Europe, traded down through Celtic middlemen. Ivory and gold came north from sub-Saharan Africa through desert caravan routes. Slaves moved in every direction. Carthaginian workshops produced fine glasswork, jewelry, carved ivory objects, and high-quality textiles that were exported across the Mediterranean. The city's merchants kept meticulous records of weights and measures, using standardized units that made transactions legible regardless of where in the network they took place. At the physical heart of this commercial empire stood the harbor. The outer port, a large rectangular basin connected to the sea by a broad, arced channel, received the merchant ships. It measured roughly 300 meters by 150, with stone quays along its walls where ships could tie up, unload, and reload under the supervision of harbor officials. Warehouses lined the waterfront. Customs agents assessed the value of incoming cargo and collected the duties that filled the city's treasury. Foreign merchants arrived here from every corner of the Mediterranean: Greeks, Italians, Egyptians, Iberians, and were received and traded with on equal terms. Carthage welcomed anyone who could pay. Behind the commercial port, separated from it by a narrow passage, lay the military harbor, the Kothon. It was circular, approximately 325 meters across, with a small island at its center where the admiral's tower rose above the surrounding roofline. Around the inner circumference of the basin, 220 covered ship sheds housed the war fleet, each shed fronted by two Ionic columns that gave the whole structure the appearance of a great colonnaded gallery built around a lagoon. The entrance from the commercial port was only 20 meters wide and could be sealed shut with iron chains. From the outside, nothing of the military harbor was visible. No foreign ship entering the commercial port could see how many warships were docked inside, how they were armed, or when they were preparing to sail. The food that fed the population of this city, which at its height probably reached 300 to 400,000 people, came from a network of farms, estates, dependent towns that spread across the fertile Tunisian interior and the coastline east and west of the city. Carthage pioneered agricultural techniques that would later be admired and copied by Roman writers. A Carthaginian landowner named Mago compiled a vast agricultural handbook running to 28 volumes, covering everything from the cultivation of grapes and olives to the management of livestock and the production of wine. When Carthage fell, it was one of the few Carthaginian texts the Roman Senate chose to preserve rather than burn. They had it translated into Latin and distributed to farmers across Italy. Allied cities across the empire, Utica, Gades, the colonies of Sardinia and Sicily, were not ruled directly from Carthage in the manner of a conventional empire. They retained their own magistrates, won their own local laws, their own customs and calendars. What they owed Carthage was tribute, military service when called upon, and exclusive commercial access in certain categories of trade. In return, Carthage's navy protected their shipping lanes, Carthage's diplomats negotiated treaties on their behalf, and Carthage's temples guaranteed the sanctity of their commercial contracts. It was a system based on mutual benefit rather than military occupation, closer in structure to a commercial confederation than to an empire in any traditional sense. No Roman legion enforced its edges. No garrison held its subject cities in check. It ran on the shared interest of people who needed each other and knew it. This was the model that Rome would spend a century trying to destroy. Not because it was weak. It was demonstrably not weak. Not because it was barbaric. Aristotle had praised its constitution above most of those in the Greek world. Rome found it threatening for a simpler reason. It worked, and it worked without Rome, and a Mediterranean organized around Carthaginian commercial logic would have no particular need for the kind of empire Rome was building. Carthage did not need to conquer its neighbors to draw wealth from them. It simply needed to trade with them. And trading with Carthage made them part of a network that answered to no one in Rome. Standing in the Agora on a morning in the 3rd century BC, you would have heard a dozen languages spoken within the space of a single hour. Punic and Libyan, Greek and Iberian, fragments of Celtic dialects from the Atlantic coast, yet the Aramaic of Eastern merchants passing through on their way somewhere further west. You would have seen bolts of Tyrian-dyed cloth unrolled for inspection alongside Spanish silver ingots, jars of Sardinian wine stacked next to sacks of North African grain. Above the market, on the Bursa Hill, the great temple complex looked out over the city and the sea. Below it, in the council house, the suffets were already in session. In the circular harbor behind the market wall, the oars of a warship were being counted back into their storage racks after a night patrol. The city was at work, as it had been every morning for 3 centuries, and as it planned to be for 3 centuries more. The Phoenician world had always been built on the knowledge of what lay beyond the next headland. Every generation of sailors pushed the boundaries a little further. and what had once been the edge of the known world became, within a century, a familiar waypoint on a well-worn route. By the 6th century BC, Carthage had inherited this tradition in full and was beginning to invest in something that went beyond simple trading expansion. The city was funding deliberate voyages of discovery, state-sanctioned expeditions into genuinely unknown waters, with the specific purpose of finding out what was there and securing whatever commercial advantage that knowledge could provide. The question of what lay south of the Sahara had been gnawing at the edges of Mediterranean knowledge for generations. Carthaginian ships already hugged the Atlantic coast of Morocco as far as the settlement at Essaouira. Below that point, the coastline curved away into waters that no Mediterranean sailor had navigated with any confidence. Around 600 BC, an Egyptian pharaoh named Necho II commissioned a Phoenician crew to answer a question no one had yet been able to ask properly. Was Africa an island? Could a ship leave the Red Sea, sail south around the continent, and return to Egypt from the west? The pharaoh wanted to know the shape of the world he ruled over. He found the best sailors available to find out. The fleet departed from the Red Sea coast of Egypt and turned south. They sailed through waters already familiar from generations of Egyptian trade with the eastern African coast, then pushed on past the Horn of Africa into unknown southern waters. Each autumn, when the sailing season closed, they pulled into shore and planted crops. They waited out the season, harvested what they had grown to replenish their supplies, then put to sea again with the following spring. The journey consumed 3 full years of their lives. In the 3rd year, they rounded the southern tip of Africa, what would not be named the Cape of Good Hope for another 2,000 years, and emerged into the Atlantic. They passed north through the Gulf of Guinea, held their course up the Atlantic coast, and came back through the Pillars of Hercules into the Mediterranean. Africa was not an island, it was a continent, and they had gone around it. When they reported back, they mentioned something that the Greek historian Herodotus, writing a century and a half later, found so implausible that he noted his disbelief explicitly. As they rounded the southern end of Africa and turned westward, the sailors said, "And the sun had been on their right, to the north of them." Herodotus did not believe it. Scholars since have recognized it as the most compelling evidence that the voyage actually happened. A ship sailing west below the Tropic of Capricorn would find exactly that. The sun arcing across the northern sky to the right of a westward heading. It was precisely the kind of detail that no one sitting in the Mediterranean could have invented, because nothing in Mediterranean experience would have suggested it. The sailors knew what they had seen. Herodotus simply lacked the frame of reference to trust them. Carthage absorbed this knowledge as it absorbed all commercial knowledge, carefully and with an eye to what advantage it might yield. The circumnavigation was almost certainly never repeated as a routine voyage. The distances were too great, yet the cost too high, and the practical commercial benefit too uncertain to justify regular expeditions around the Cape. But the knowledge that Africa could be sailed around was now in the city's libraries, in the records of its merchant families, and in the minds of the navigators and strategists who planned its maritime expansion. It shaped how Carthage understood the world, even if the world did not yet understand what Carthage knew. The man who embodied Carthage's age of exploration most completely was a navigator and official of the city named Hanno. Probably a member of the aristocratic Maganid family that provided Carthage with many of its leading figures in the 5th century BC, thus Hanno was dispatched by the city on a mission that combined colonization and discovery in the manner that Carthaginian expansion had always preferred, sending settlers and sailors simultaneously, building new communities as they went, rather than simply mapping a coastline and returning. He sailed from Carthage with 60 ships carrying 30,000 men and women, a number ancient sources almost certainly inflate, but which points to a genuine mass expedition rather than a scouting mission. The fleet passed through the Pillars of Hercules and turned south along the Atlantic coast of Africa. In the first days, they were in waters already known to Carthaginian sailors: the coast of Morocco, the Atlantic ports of Lixus and Mogador. Hanno founded or resettled several colonies along the Moroccan coast, establishing the permanent presence that the city wanted along this stretch of the Atlantic. Then, when the last colony had been settled and the settlers landed, the remaining fleet turned further south and entered waters no Carthaginian had systematically charted. The account Hanno left behind was inscribed on a bronze or stone tablet and hung in the temple of Baal Hammon in Carthage, the city's formal record of what it had done and where it had been. The original was lost when the city burned. What survives is a Greek translation, abridged and damaged in places, preserved in a single medieval manuscript that spent centuries in a library in Heidelberg. Through that fragile thread, Hanno's voice reaches forward across 2.5 millennia. He writes in the first person, calmly, with the tone of a man making a practical record of a practical journey, noting distances, resources, peoples encountered, landmarks observed. The peoples he met along the way ranged from the hospitable to the hostile. On the Moroccan coast, a nomadic group called the Lixite provided his ships with interpreters, without whom the expedition could not have communicated with the peoples further south. Beyond the last familiar settlement, the coast became increasingly strange and the peoples increasingly unlike anything the Carthaginians had seen before. Hanno recorded languages that even his Lixite interpreters could not understand, coastal fires burning at night in patterns that suggested large populations moving in ways his ships could not follow, now in a coastline that offered fewer and fewer safe anchorages as it curved steadily southeast. He described passing a high coast filled with fragrant burning forests, with rivers of fire running down to the sea at night. Almost certainly the volcanic landscapes of Guinea, where bushfires lit by seasonal agriculture spread across the hillsides in sheets of flame visible from far out to sea. Then came a night when the entire coast blazed, and above it, a single fire towered above all the others, reaching so high into the sky that Hanno thought it touched the stars. Modern scholars have identified this with reasonable confidence as Mount Cameroon, a 4,000-meter active volcano on the coast of what is now Cameroon, the tallest mountain in West Africa, which erupts with a frequency that made it almost certainly active in Hanno's time. If Mount Cameroon is the correct identification, Hanno had sailed more than 4,000 kilometers south of the Pillars of Hercules. Near the end of the voyage, in a bay that Hanno called the Southern Horn, the expedition encountered creatures they could not identify. The local people called them by a name that his Lixite interpreters rendered as something like gorillae. They were covered in dark hair. The females far outnumbered the males, and when the Carthaginians tried to pursue them, the males escaped over rocky precipices while 3 females were caught. The creatures fought so violently against their captors, biting and clawing, that they had to be killed. Their skins were brought back to Carthage and displayed in the temple of Tanit, where they remained until the city fell. The creatures were probably chimpanzees, or possibly the great apes that now bear a name derived directly from Hanno's account. When the American naturalist Thomas Savage wrote the first scientific description of a gorilla in the 19th century, he named the species after the mysterious creatures in the Periplus. The word gorilla is Hanno's word, 2,500 years old. While Hanno sailed south, a contemporary of his, probably his brother, possibly a close colleague, was sailing in the opposite direction. His name was Himilco, and he turned north from the Pillars of Hercules rather than south, following the Atlantic coast of Spain and France into waters that the Mediterranean world knew even less about than the African shore. His account, like Hanno's, was committed to writing and preserved in Carthage's archives. Unlike Hanno's, the original has not survived even in translation, and what remains are fragments quoted by a Roman writer named Avienus, some 900 years after the voyage took place. Through those fragments, Himilco's voice is the faintest of echoes, but what it says is unmistakable. Himilco sailed north, past the tin-producing coasts of Brittany, a region called the Estrymnides in his account, where local people put to sea in boats made of hide stretched over wicker frames, sailing through Atlantic swells that would have swamped any Mediterranean vessel. He noted the British Isles, which Avienus records under names that are recognizably Proto-Celtic forms of Britain and Ireland. He wrote about the Atlantic itself in terms designed, almost certainly deliberately, and to discourage anyone else from following him there. Becalmed seas clogged with seaweed that caught at the keel like a net, shallow shoals that could ground a ship without warning, and vast sea creatures moving through the water beneath the hulls at night. Scholars have long recognized these descriptions as probable deliberate exaggeration. Carthage had no interest in advertising the routes to the tin and amber trades of northern Europe. What Himilco had found was too valuable to share, and the monsters he reported kept the competition at home. Religion in Carthage was not a separate compartment of life. It ran through everything: the harbor and the marketplace, the law courts and the family home, the ships departing at dawn, and the graves cut into the red earth on the edge of the city. The gods were not distant figures invoked on special occasions. They were present in the smell of incense drifting from a temple doorway, in the palm trees stamped on the face of every silver coin, in the small terracotta figurine of a goddess standing in the corner of a workshop beside the tools. The boundary between the sacred and the ordinary barely existed. Every act of trade, every contract sworn, every voyage begun was threaded through with religious obligation. The city's pantheon had arrived with the Phoenician settlers from Tyre and had been growing ever since, absorbing local North African deities, borrowing from Egypt and Greece, and producing a religious landscape that reflected Carthage's nature as a crossroads civilization. The gods of the Phoenician homeland, Melkart, Astarte, Eshmun, Resheph, maintained their temples and their priesthoods in the city for centuries. But two deities emerged over time that were distinctively Carthaginian, shaped by the city's particular identity and its long roots in North African soil. They were Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Baal-Hamon was the older of the two in Carthaginian worship, a sky and weather god whose name probably meant Lord of the Incense Altar, though the precise etymology remains disputed. He was depicted as a bearded older man, seated on a throne flanked by rams wearing a tall cylindrical crown. The ram was his animal, an emblem of fertility and masculine force, and he was worshipped on hilltops open to the sky where the wind and rain moved freely. Across the bay from Carthage and the twin-peaked mountain now called Jebel Bukornin, the two-horned hill, was his sacred ground. The Greeks associated him with Cronus, the Romans with Saturn, recognizing in his character the quality of a remote, ancient, cosmically powerful force that demanded respect and appeasement in equal measure. Tanit arrived later. Her worship is not attested in Carthage before the 5th century BC, but when it came, it spread with a speed that suggests she was filling a need the existing pantheon had left open. She was a North African goddess in origin. Her name may carry Berber roots, and her cult reflected the maternal religious traditions of the indigenous peoples the Carthaginians had lived among for 3 centuries. She was the consort of Baal-Hamon, given the formal title Tinnet Face of Bel. But she did not remain subordinate to him for long. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, her name appeared before his on dedicatory monuments. She had become the city's first goddess, protector of Carthage, mother of the people, guardian of the home and the harbor alike. Her symbol was everywhere: a triangle for the female body, a horizontal bar for the outstretched arms, a circle for the head, a figure simultaneously abstract and unmistakably human, stamped onto stelae and coins, painted onto ship hulls, scratched into the lintels of house doors. It was the most widely reproduced religious image in the Punic world. Women marked their houses with it to ask for her protection. Sailors carried it on their vessels. When the Roman conquerors eventually raised a new city on the ruins of Carthage, this Tanit was absorbed into Roman religion under the name Dea Celestis, the heavenly goddess, and she remained the most widely worshipped deity in Roman North Africa for 4 centuries after the city that had given birth to her was ash. The priests of Carthage were a wealthy and powerful class. The great temple of Eshmun, the healing god whom the Greeks associated with Asclepius, stood at the summit of the Bursa hill and was one of the largest religious structures in the ancient Mediterranean. Its treasury accumulated offerings from generations of worshippers seeking cure from illness, relief from injury, safe passage through disease. The temple complex covered the entire hilltop, ringed with colonnades, its inner sanctuary accessible only to the initiated. The priests who served it held high social standing, so negotiated on behalf of the city in religious disputes, and managed estates that produced significant agricultural income. Their robes were white linen, their heads shaved in the Egyptian manner that Carthaginian religious practice had inherited from centuries of contact across the sea. Ordinary religious life in the city was more intimate. Every home had its household gods, small clay figurines, masks, amulets, and offerings were made at domestic shrines in much the way they were made at the great temples. Incense burned, food and wine poured out, small animals killed on portable altars. The fertility goddess appeared in Carthaginian homes in dozens of forms, standing, seated, holding a child, holding a mirror, draped and under-aped. And these objects moved freely through trade across the entire Mediterranean. Then Carthaginian figurines have been found in graves in Sicily, on the coasts of Spain, in the ports of Italy. They were not just religious objects. They were evidence of a culture that traveled with its people, that made itself at home in every port. The most distinctive and most debated feature of Carthaginian religious life was a sacred precinct that stood to the west of the city's main harbors, separated from the regular cemeteries of the general population in an open-air enclosure of low walls and standing stones. It was called, in later Hebrew tradition, a Tofet, a word whose precise Punic equivalent is unknown since no Carthaginian religious texts survive. What it contained were urns, thousands of them, arranged in rows, sealed with stone lids, many marked with small carved stelae bearing inscriptions addressed to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. Inside the urns were cremated remains, the burned bones of animals, mostly sheep and goats, and of human infants. The inscriptions on these stelae followed a consistent pattern that has no parallel in any other ancient burial context. They did not mark a death. They recorded a transaction. A man or woman had made a vow to the gods, had asked for something, had promised something in return if the gods delivered. And the stele recorded the fulfillment of that vow. The name of the dedicant appeared. The name of the gods appeared. The thing that had been promised was not named on the stone. The dead child was never named at all. Whatever was placed in the urn was not commemorated as a person who had lived and died. It was offered as a fulfillment of a promise. The question of what that promise entailed has divided scholars for generations, and the honest answer is that it has not been resolved. One body of evidence points toward child sacrifice as at least a part of the Tofet's function. Ancient Greek and Roman writers describe the practice in explicit terms, and some of these writers, whatever their biases, were operating closer in time to the city than any modern observer. The inscriptions are votive, not funerary. The age distribution of some of the remains in certain periods and at certain sites appears skewed in ways that do not straightforwardly match the expected patterns of natural infant mortality. And the animals buried in the same urns were almost certainly sacrificed. The parallel treatment of animal and human remains is difficult to dismiss. The opposing argument is grounded in the same physical evidence read differently. Infant mortality in a crowded ancient city ran extraordinarily high. Perhaps 30 to 40% of all children born alive did not survive their first year. In that world, the Tofet may have served as a consecrated burial ground for the very young, a sacred place where children who had died before being fully received into the community were given to the gods rather than interred in the main cemetery alongside adults. Many of the remains show ages consistent with stillbirth or death in the first days of life. Many urns contain the remains of multiple individuals gathered together in a single container, which is not how a deliberate sacrifice of named individuals tends to be organized. A sacred space for the grief of infant death, consecrated to the most powerful deities in the city, does not require deliberate killing to explain its existence. What the Tofet was is probably not a single thing across the 6 centuries of Carthage's existence. The earliest levels of the precinct show patterns consistent with natural infant burial. The later levels, from the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, the period when Greek and Roman accounts of sacrifice concentrate, show patterns that are harder to explain by natural mortality alone. The practice almost certainly evolved over time, perhaps beginning as a sacred burial ground for the naturally deceased youngest children, perhaps developing in later centuries under the pressure of war and crisis, and into something darker and more deliberate. Both possibilities may have been true at different times for different families under different circumstances. The Tofet held more than one kind of grief. What the city's enemies said about it, that the Carthaginians sacrificed their young on bronze statues before cheering crowds, that wealthy families bought poor children to sacrifice in place of their own, carries the unmistakable flavor of wartime propaganda. The Greeks and Romans who produced these accounts were writing about an enemy, often in the middle of a conflict, and the details they supply are precisely calculated to produce maximum revulsion in a Mediterranean audience. This does not make the underlying practice fictional, but it almost certainly makes the accounts wildly exaggerated, is stripped of the religious context that gave these acts meaning to the people who performed them, and reframed as spectacle for a hostile readership. The full truth of the Tofet died with the city that built it. No Carthaginian priest ever wrote an explanation of what these rites meant, what comfort or terror attended them, what prayers were spoken over the sealed urns. Every document that might have answered the question burned in 146 BC, and what remains is the physical evidence, thousands of small clay vessels in the Tunisian earth, and the hostile testimony of the people who destroyed the city that made them. History has rarely produced a colder irony. The only voices explaining Carthage's most intimate religious practices are the voices of those who killed every Carthaginian who could have spoken for themselves. What the Tofet cannot obscure, and what the temples and figurines and household shrines and sailors' amulets and coin images and hilltop altars all confirm, is that the Carthaginians lived in a world saturated with the divine. Their gods were not remote. They were present in the palm tree on the coin in your hand, in the triangle scratched above the front door, in the smell of the incense rising from the altar at the corner of the market, in the name you carved into the stone above the urn. Whatever you asked for, whatever you promised, whatever it cost you. The gods were listening, and the transaction was real, and the city that stood around you was proof that it had always been worth paying. Sicily sits at the dead center of the Mediterranean, a triangular island of extraordinary fertility perched on the fault line where the African and European continental plates grind together. Mount Etna dominates its eastern coast, a 3,000-meter volcano that has erupted regularly since before human memory, spreading fine ash across the surrounding farmland and giving the island's soil a richness that made it the most productive agricultural territory in the ancient sea. Whoever held Sicily held the granary of the Western Mediterranean, the strategic midpoint between Europe and Africa, and the gateway between the eastern and western halves of the sea. Both Carthage and the Greeks understood this. They had both been present on the island since the 8th century BC. For nearly 300 years, they tried to share it. They failed. And the Phoenicians had arrived in Sicily before the Greeks, establishing trading posts along its western coast at Mocha, Panormus, and Solantum, small, well-positioned harbor towns that gave them control of the sea lanes between Sicily and the North African coast. When Greek colonists began pushing west along the island's southern and eastern shores from the mid-8th century onwards, the two peoples occupied different parts of the same island without, at first, direct conflict. Trade passed between them. Native Sicilian peoples occupied the interior. For perhaps a century, the arrangement was workable, if uneasy. The first serious collision came in 580 BC, when a group of Greek colonists from Cnidus and Rhodes attempted to plant a settlement close to the Phoenician zone in the west of the island. The Phoenician cities and their Elymian allies drove them out by force. It was a minor episode, but it established the fault line that would define Sicilian politics for the next 3 centuries. The western third of the island as Carthaginian territory, the eastern 2/3 as Greek, and a contested borderland between them where every local dispute threatened to pull the two great powers into open war. The Greeks called this contested middle zone what it was, the edge of everything they had built, and the place where it could all be lost. Carthage's first major military intervention on the island came in 480 BC under the command of a general named Himilco. The exact trigger was a feud between Greek Sicilian city-states in which one faction appealed to Carthage for support. The kind of invitation Carthage had rarely needed twice. Himilco arrived with a large expeditionary force and besieged the Greek city of Himera on the island's north coast. What happened next became one of the defining moments in Greek Sicilian memory. Gilon, the tyrant of Syracuse, brought his army west at speed and met the Carthaginians in battle at Himera. The Carthaginians were decisively routed. Himilco himself died in the battle, either killed in the fighting or, as Greek tradition preferred, throwing himself onto his own sacrificial fire in despair when he saw the day was lost. His bones were never returned to Carthage. The gold paid in reparations funded 2 Greek temples that stood at Himera for generations, physical monuments to Carthaginian defeat. After Himera, Carthage withdrew from Sicily for 70 years. It was not a permanent concession, but a practical reassessment. Yes, the city turned its energies inward, consolidating control of North Africa, expanding its agricultural hinterland, tightening its grip on Sardinia. The silver mines of Spain continued to flow. The fleet was maintained and expanded. When Carthage returned to Sicily in 409 BC, it did so not in haste, but with the full weight of a mature empire that had spent 7 decades preparing to finish what Himilco had started. The expedition was commanded by Hannibal Mago, the grandson of the general who had died at Himera. He destroyed the city of Himera itself, razed it to the ground, and put 3,000 Greek prisoners to death on the exact spot where his grandfather had fallen. The wars that followed consumed Sicily for the next century. City after city changed hands. The Greeks built tyrants to fight back, military strongmen like Dionysius I of Syracuse, who raised professional armies, built enormous walls, and matched Carthaginian military innovation with his own. He struck at the Carthaginian stronghold of Mocha in 397 BC, took it, and filled the harbor with rubble to deny it to future use. Carthage responded by founding a new western capital at Lilybaeum, a better defended site on a peninsula that proved nearly impossible to take. Every advance was answered, every advantage was erased. The island hemorrhaged people and wealth, and neither side could force a conclusion. What these wars revealed about Carthage was both its great strength and its deepest structural weakness. The strength was its capacity to absorb loss. The armies destroyed in Sicily could be replaced with new levies from North Africa, Spain, Sardinia, and the Numidian and Celtic territories around the empire. The treasury, fed by the silver mines and the trade network, could finance another campaign as soon as the last one ended. Carthage could lose battles in Sicily for decades and still be standing, still building ships, still paying soldiers, because the commercial empire that funded its wars was not located in Sicily and could not be touched by any Sicilian defeat. The weakness was the army itself. Carthage had built its military on a foundation of allied and mercenary forces, a deliberate political choice that kept its own citizens off the battlefield and insulated the Senate from the human cost of prolonged war. Numidian cavalry from the west, Libyan spearmen from the east, the Iberian swordsmen from Spain, slingers from the Balearic Islands. Each unit was superb at what it was recruited to do. But an army that spoke a dozen languages, owed its loyalty to its paymaster rather than to any shared cause, and was drawn from peoples with deeply different fighting traditions, required commanders of exceptional ability to hold together in the field. When the commanders were good, these armies were devastating. When they were not, or when the pay was late, the seams showed. The contest in Sicily ground into its 3rd century with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow, when a new figure entered the arena who would change the terms of the conflict entirely. His name was Agathocles, and he was the son of a potter from the Greek Sicilian city of Thermae. He had risen through Syracuse's military ranks by a combination of genuine tactical ability and a complete absence of scruple, seized power in 317 BC by having the city's 600 leading aristocrats massacred in the marketplace, and then proceeded to declare himself king of the largest Greek state in the western Mediterranean. He was not a man inclined to fight defensively. By 311 BC, the Carthaginians had had enough of him. They sent a large army to Sicily under a general named Hamilcar, defeated Agathocles at the Battle of the Himera River, and marched on Syracuse. The city was surrounded, the Carthaginian army besieging it on the landward side, their fleet blockading the harbor from the sea. For any conventional commander, the situation was finished. Agathocles looked at his options and chose the one that made no sense. He stripped the city of every soldier it could spare, loaded them onto 60 ships, broke through the Carthaginian blockade under cover of night, and set sail not for safety, but directly for the coast of Africa. He was going to attack Carthage. He landed at Cape Bon in August of 310 BC, 110 kilometers from the city of Carthage, after 6 days at sea. The moment his soldiers were ashore, he ordered the ships burned. There would be no retreat. His men could sail home in victory or not at all. Then he marched. The Carthaginian countryside around him was rich, peaceful, and completely unprepared for war, a landscape of well-tended estates, prosperous towns, and people who had lived their entire lives with the assumption that war was something that happened in Sicily, not here. Agathocles stripped it as he passed. His soldiers were laden with plunder before they had gone 20 kilometers. The panic inside Carthage when news reached the city was unlike anything its citizens had experienced. For the first time in their history, the war had come home. The army was in Sicily. The fleet was besieging Syracuse. The city itself, the triple-walled citadel, the great harbor, the temples of Tanit and Baal Hamon, stood virtually undefended. The Council of Elders hastily scraped together a citizen force from the marketplace, the workshops, the temple precincts, arming men who had never carried a spear in anger in their lives, and marched them out to meet the Greeks. Agathocles routed them completely. In their abandoned camp, his soldiers found something that said everything about how certain of victory the Carthaginians had been before this day. More than 20,000 pairs of iron manacles prepared in advance to chain the Greek prisoners they had expected to capture. Agathocles rampaged through the Carthaginian countryside for 3 years. He could not take the city. Its walls were too strong, and he had no siege train capable of breaching them. But he did not need to. He burned farms, seized towns, and recruited discontented Libyan subjects of Carthage to his cause, demonstrating to every power in the Mediterranean that the heart of the Carthaginian Empire was not as impregnable as its reputation suggested. In the end, he was undone not by Carthage, but by his own absence from Sicily, where his subordinates lost the ground he had spent years winning. He slipped away from Africa at night, leaving his army behind, and negotiated a peace in 306 BC that returned the situation in Sicily to exactly where it had been before the war began. The lesson the episode left behind was one that different people read differently. For Carthage, it was a reminder of the one thing its commercial model could not buy: an army of citizens who would fight to the last for their own city. For everyone watching, every ambitious ruler in the Greek world, every strategic mind in a city that was quietly growing powerful in the river plains of central Italy, it was proof of something more dangerous. Carthage was rich. Carthage was ancient. Carthage had the finest harbor and the largest fleet in the Mediterranean. And a potter's son from Sicily had come within a day's march of burning it to the ground. Hannibal was born in 247 BC, the year his father Himilco took command of the Carthaginian army in Sicily during the final grinding years of the First Punic War. He grew up in a family whose entire identity had been shaped by that conflict, by the humiliation of its ending, by the catastrophic terms of the peace treaty, by the loss of Sicily and then Sardinia, by the mercenary war that followed and nearly consumed the city while the Romans watched. His father's nickname, Barca, meant thunderbolt in Punic. The name was an emblem of the aggressive, uncompromising military style that had kept the Carthaginian army in the field even when the war was already lost politically. Hannibal inherited it as a surname, a family philosophy, and a personal standard. When Hannibal was 9 years old, his father prepared to leave for Spain, the great Western project that would rebuild Carthage's wealth and military capacity on a new foundation. The boy begged to go with him. Himilco agreed on one condition. He led his son to the altar where the sacrificial fire burned and made him place his hand on the victim and swear that he would never be a friend of Rome. It was an oath taken by a child young enough to weep at the thought of being left behind, and it would define the next 50 years of his life. He kept it absolutely without exception until his death. He grew up in Spain, in the military camps his father carved out of the Iberian interior. He learned war the same way he learned everything else: by watching it, then doing it in the field, under real conditions, alongside soldiers from a dozen different peoples and cultures. He was 18 when his father drowned in battle against a local Iberian tribe in 228 BC. His brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, took command and continued the work for 7 more years by diplomacy as much as by force, until an assassin's knife ended his life in 221 BC. The army in Spain did not wait for instructions from Carthage. They elected Hannibal their commander by acclamation, and the Senate in Carthage confirmed the appointment. He was 26 years old. Within 2 years, he had demonstrated what his soldiers already knew. He was his father recreated, the same physical presence, the same quality of absolute conviction on a battlefield, the same capacity to hold the loyalty of men who had no particular reason to die for him, except that he had never yet led them wrong. He had also inherited his father's strategic intelligence, which was considerably more sophisticated than his father's had been, because Hannibal had spent his formative years studying every war Carthage had fought and every general Greek and Roman who had fought them. He knew what had worked. He knew what had failed. He had spent 20 years forming a theory of how to destroy Rome, and by 219 BC, he was ready to test it. The trigger was the Roman allied city of Saguntum, situated on the eastern coast of Spain, south of the agreed boundary between Roman and Carthaginian spheres of influence. Hannibal had watched Saguntum for months, its citizens conducting raids against Carthage's local allies, its walls rising above the coastal plain as a symbol of Roman reach into territory he considered his. In 219 BC, he marched his army against it and put it under siege. The Romans sent envoys to his camp. He had his staff send them away, explaining he was too busy to receive them. The siege lasted 8 months. Saguntum fell. Rome declared war. Hannibal had known it would, and he had already made his plans. His strategic logic was clear and had been clear to him for years. Carthage could not fight Rome at sea. The First Punic War had proven that the Romans could build a fleet fast enough and fight with enough desperate tenacity to grind down even a naval power with 1,000 years of maritime tradition behind it. Carthage could not wait for Rome to bring the war to Spain. The Romans would land in force, the silver mines would fall, and the army would find itself fighting on shrinking ground with no prospect of relief. The only option that offered any real chance of ending Roman power permanently was to take the war directly to Italy, to march through the continent that Rome thought was its own secured territory, and to present the Italian cities that Rome had conquered, the Greeks, the Samnites, the Gauls of the north, with a general who could protect them from the power that had subjugated them. This was not a raid. It was a war of liberation, or at least it would present itself as one. He left New Carthage in the late spring of 218 BC with around 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. He crossed the Pyrenees fighting through the northern passes, losing a significant portion of his Iberian troops who refused to leave their homeland and were dismissed rather than forced. He crossed Gaul, and navigating around and through Celtic territories with a combination of negotiation, bribery, and controlled violence. At the Rhone, one of the largest rivers in France, he crossed the entire army on rafts and improvised boats, and solved the problem of terrified elephants by building floating platforms covered with earth, coaxing the animals aboard under the impression they were still on solid ground. Then, he turned east toward the mountains. The Alps in October were already carrying snow on the high passes. The route he chose, probably the Col de la Traversette, the highest and most southerly of the western Alpine crossings, was not the route the Romans expected or guarded. It was not the route anyone in their right mind would have chosen for an army of 50,000 men, their horses, their supply train, and 37 elephants. The local Alpine tribes harassed the column from the high ground on either side, rolling boulders down the cliff faces onto the pack animals below, rushing the flanks at night. The cold was fierce and grew fiercer with every day of ascent. The track was ice-covered and steep, and horses and mules lost their footing and fell. Men who went down on the ice did not always get up. On the 9th day of climbing, they reached the summit of the pass. The army stopped. Below them, through a gap in the cloud, lay the green plains of northern Italy, stretching south toward Rome. Hannibal rode up and down the line, pointing down into the valley, reminding his soldiers, who had been marching and fighting for the better part of 6 months, that the walls of Rome were not far beyond those plains. The descent proved more treacherous than the climb. A recent landslide had obliterated the track on the Italian side. The army spent 4 days cutting a new road into the rock face with iron tools and fire, working in bitter cold on the edge of a precipice, their food supplies nearly exhausted. Then they came down into the warmth of the foothills. He had arrived in Italy with perhaps 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, less than half the force he had started with. He had not lost a single battle. Rome was stunned. The last report they had received placed Hannibal somewhere in Gaul. Now he was in northern Italy, recruiting Gallic allies by the thousand and moving south. The Roman consul Publius Scipio rode north to intercept him and met the Carthaginian cavalry at the Ticinus River in November of 218 BC. He was beaten back and personally wounded in the engagement. In December, the combined Roman force under Sempronius Longus met Hannibal on the floodplain of the Trebia River with around 40,000 men. Hannibal lured them out of their fortified camp in the pre-dawn cold across the freezing river, hungry and wet, and then held them frontally while hidden flanking forces cut in from both sides. Most of the Roman army died on that flat ground beside the river. 10,000 soldiers fought their way out to safety. The rest did not. He spent the winter in northern Italy and moved south in the spring of 217 BC. On the morning of June 21st, a Roman army of perhaps 30,000 men under the consul Gaius Flaminius was marching along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, moving fast, and following what they believed was a retreating Carthaginian force. The hills above the lake road were hidden in early morning mist. Hannibal had concealed his entire army in those hills, infantry, cavalry, light troops, arranged in a semicircle that enclosed nearly 4 kilometers of shoreline. When the last Roman column had entered the trap and the signal was given, every unit broke cover simultaneously. The Romans had no room to form up, no room to fight in any organized way, and nowhere to run except into the lake. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. 15,000 Romans died. The commander Flaminius died with them. When news of Trasimene reached Rome, the city went silent first, then erupted. It was the worst military disaster in Roman history until the following year. In the summer of 216 BC, the Romans assembled the largest army they had ever put in the field. 86,000 soldiers, the full strength of the Roman and Italian allied forces, commanded by 2 consuls who were instructed to find Hannibal and destroy him. They found him at a small town in Apulia called Cannae. Hannibal had 20,000 fewer soldiers than the Romans. He placed his weakest troops, Celtic and Spanish infantry, at the center of his line and his best African veterans in compact, powerful wings on either side. The Roman mass drove forward into the center, exactly as he had anticipated, and pushed the Carthaginian line backward in an arc. The wings held. As the Roman formation compressed into the pocket, Hannibal's cavalry swept around the rear and closed the circle. What followed was not a battle. It was a killing ground. At least 67,000 Romans died before the day was over. Senators died at Cannae. Consuls died at Cannae. The Roman aristocracy measured its losses in family names. Boys of 17 were conscripted into the legions. Criminals were freed to serve. Slaves were armed. The Romans resorted to human sacrifice, Greeks and Gauls entombed in the cattle market, to placate gods who had clearly turned away from them. Hannibal now controlled most of southern Italy. Several major cities, including Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened their gates to him. Sicily began to waver. It looked, to every ruler watching from the outside, as though Rome was finished. But Rome was not finished. It refused, in the way it had always refused, to admit that a war it was losing was a war it had lost. It appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator with a single strategic directive: avoid pitched battle, follow Hannibal, cut off his foragers, burn the grain fields before he could harvest them, deny him a decisive engagement, and starve him of supplies and reinforcements. Hannibal rampaged through Italy for another 12 years. He never lost a battle of any significance. He never received meaningful reinforcement from Carthage, whose senate was divided, whose treasury was stretched, and whose navy could not challenge Rome's control of the sea lanes. He came to the walls of Rome itself in 211 BC and looked up at them. They were too high, too thick, and he had no siege equipment. He turned away. Yet the war turned when a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio did to Carthage in Spain what Hannibal had done to Rome in Italy. He struck the unexpected point with total commitment and at exactly the right moment. In 209 BC, he took New Carthage by a surprise assault, seizing the treasury, the hostages, and the administrative center of the entire Spanish Empire in a single day. 3 years later, the last Carthaginian army in Spain was broken at the Battle of Elissa. The silver mines were gone. The Spanish provinces were gone. The foundation on which Hannibal's entire campaign had been built collapsed beneath him. In 204 BC, Scipio crossed to Africa and landed on the Carthaginian shore. The city panicked and recalled Hannibal from Italy, a recall that Hannibal, by all accounts, received with fury and grief. He had held Italy for 15 years without losing a battle, and he was being called home to fight a defensive war in the country he had spent his entire career trying to avoid turning into a battlefield. He sailed from the Italian coast in 203 BC, leaving behind the bones of over 100,000 Roman soldiers who had died facing him. They met at Zama in the autumn of 202 BC, 120 kilometers southwest of Carthage. The Numidian cavalry that had always ridden for Carthage now rode for Rome. Hannibal's 80 elephants charged and were channeled into gaps in the Roman lines, turned and driven back through their own formations. The Numidians hit the Carthaginian rear. The army collapsed. It was the first battle Hannibal had ever lost, and it ended the war. The terms Scipio imposed on Carthage after Zama in 201 BC were designed to make the city permanently harmless. The entire war fleet was surrendered and burned in the harbor. Every warship that had once made Carthage the master of the Western Sea reduced to charred timber on the water. All war elephants were handed over to Rome. The army was disbanded. All territory outside the immediate hinterland of the city in North Africa was stripped away. Carthage was forbidden from waging war on anyone anywhere without the explicit permission of Rome, including in defense of its own territory. It was required to pay 200 talents of silver a year for 50 years. A total of 10,000 talents, nearly 5 times the indemnity imposed after the First Punic War. When the last payment was made, it would be the year 152 BC. Thus, the city would have been paying for Hannibal's war for half a century. Rome expected to find a broken city, hollowed out by war debt and stripped of every instrument of power. What happened instead was something that Rome's Senate, in its quieter moments, should probably have anticipated. Freed of the obligations of maintaining colonies across the Mediterranean, freed of the cost of defending far-flung territories, freed of the drain of garrisoning Sicily and Sardinia and Spain, Carthage turned inward. It concentrated on the one thing it had always done better than anyone else. It traded. And without a navy to fund, without an army to feed, without distant wars consuming its silver, the money it made stayed home. Within a decade of Zama, Carthage was growing again. New residential districts rose on the hillsides above the harbor. The ports were renovated. Olive groves were planted across the hinterland, carefully managed by estate owners following the detailed prescriptions in Mago's agricultural handbook. Wheat and barley poured out of the Tunisian interior at volumes the pre-war city had never matched, because the land that had once been used to supply distant armies was now producing purely for trade. Carthaginian grain ships sailed to Rome. Carthaginian merchants were present in every major port of the eastern Mediterranean. The commercial network that 2 Punic wars had failed to destroy was reconstituting itself, pulling in wealth from every direction, flowing into a city that had no military expenditure to absorb it. Hannibal himself, in the years immediately after Zama, tried to accelerate this recovery through structural reform. Then he was elected suffet in 196 BC, the highest civil office in the city, and immediately turned his attention to the tax system, specifically to the corruption embedded in it. Customs revenues collected at the harbor had been quietly absorbed by individual officials for generations. Hannibal pushed through reforms that broke this system open, redirected the missing funds back into the public treasury, and demonstrated that Carthage could meet its annual payment to Rome from customs duties alone, without any additional taxation on its citizens. The reforms were so effective and so threatening to the established financial interests of the oligarchy that those same interests appealed to Rome to remove him. In 195 BC, facing Roman pressure and the certainty of arrest, Hannibal left Carthage for the last time and went into exile in the eastern Mediterranean, where he spent his final years advising Hellenistic kings against Rome before taking poison in 183 BC rather than be delivered to his enemies in chains. The Carthaginian Senate had expelled the man who had nearly destroyed Rome and who was now rebuilding its rival, and had done so at Rome's request with no apparent appreciation of the irony. The oligarchs who ousted him were the same class of men who had starved him of reinforcements during his 15 years in Italy, who had preferred a comfortable peace to the risks of total war. They got the peace they had always wanted, and Carthage flourished under it in spite of them. By 191 BC, only 10 years after Zama, Carthage sent envoys to Rome offering to pay off the entire remaining war indemnity in a single lump sum. Rome declined. The annual payments were too useful, and a Carthage in permanent debt was more manageable than a Carthage that had cleared its accounts and owed Rome nothing. For the following 50 years, Carthage did everything that was asked of it. It made its annual payments. It sought Roman arbitration when it had disputes with its neighbors. It sent grain to Rome and supported Rome's wars in the East with financial contributions. It observed the letter of every treaty clause with a scrupulousness that bordered on supplication. Where its walls were rebuilt, the treaty permitted defensive fortifications within the city's own territory, and its harbor was renovated to the point where the circular military basin, though it held no warships, gleamed with fresh stonework and new columns. The city was visibly, conspicuously, gloriously prosperous, and it conducted itself as a model subject state. This, as it turned out, was precisely the problem. The problem was not Massinissa, though Massinissa was the instrument through which the problem expressed itself. Massinissa was the Numidian king who had switched sides before Zama, delivering the cavalry charge that broke Hannibal's rear and ending the Second Punic War in Rome's favor. Rome rewarded him with vast territories formerly belonging to Carthage and then protected his continued seizure of Carthaginian farmland for the next 50 years by ruling in his favor whenever Carthage appealed for arbitration. Each Roman judgment delivered another piece of Carthaginian territory to the Numidian king. Carthage lost the land, paid the legal costs of the arbitration, and received a fresh reminder that its hands were tied behind its back. Massinissa, who lived to the extraordinary age of 90 and was still riding into battle in his 80s, understood the arrangement perfectly. He was the mechanism by which Rome bled Carthage without formally declaring war. Into this situation, in the year 153 BC, arrived the man whose name would become permanently attached to Carthage's end, Marcus Porcius. Cato was 81 years old, a senator of the old school, a man who had farmed his own fields. He worn simple clothes, drunk cheap wine, and spent 60 years in public life railing against the corruption of Roman values by foreign luxury and Greek sophistication. He had fought against Hannibal as a young man at the Battle of the Metaurus in 207 BC, and the experience had left a mark on him that 60 years had not faded. He was sent to Carthage as part of a senatorial delegation to arbitrate yet another land dispute with Massinissa. He expected to find a chastened, diminished city still licking its wounds from 2 catastrophic wars. He found something else entirely. The streets were full, the markets were crowded, the harbor was busy with ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. New buildings rose on the hillsides above the old city, their limestone facades white against the blue of the bay, and the farmland around the city was dense with olive groves and well-tended estates, the irrigation channels recently dug, the roads newly maintained. The young men in the streets were not the hollow-cheeked survivors of a ruined city. They were well-fed, well-clothed, and numerous. Cato walked through Carthage and found a city that looked by every visible measure more prosperous than the Rome he had just left. He returned home carrying a bunch of fresh figs picked from a Carthaginian market, plump, ripe, still fragrant from the journey, and shook them out onto the floor of the Senate House. Carthage had grown these, he told his colleagues. Carthage was 3 days' sail away. From that moment, he concluded every speech he gave in the Senate, on grain prices, on road maintenance, on the appointment of provincial governors, on anything and everything, with the same 7 words. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. He said it hundreds of times over the following 6 years, and he said it with the particular obsessive authority of a man who had watched Hannibal's army march across Italy and had never fully recovered from the experience. Some of his colleagues found it tedious. Scipio Nasica, son-in-law of the man who had beaten Hannibal at Zama, argued consistently that Carthage should be preserved, that a prosperous rival kept Rome's military virtues sharp, and that a Rome with no external threat would grow fat and complacent. He was probably right about the consequences. He was certainly outvoted. The deeper argument, which Cato never quite articulated, but which his behavior made perfectly clear, was not about military threat. Hannibal had come closer to destroying Rome than any enemy in its history, and Carthage had been unable to finish what he started. The city had no navy, no army, no colonies, no allies, and no capacity to wage war without Rome's permission. Every objective military assessment said the same thing. Carthage was not dangerous. But Cato was not afraid of Carthage's legions. He was afraid of Carthage's example. A city that had absorbed 2 crushing defeats, paid 50 years of war reparations, been stripped of every overseas territory, and come back richer than before, was making an argument about how power worked. An argument that said armies and conquest were not the only roads to greatness, and perhaps not even the most reliable ones. That argument, left standing, so was more threatening to the Roman model than any number of Carthaginian warships. The pretext for war, when it finally came, was manufactured from Carthage's own desperation. By 150 BC, Massinissa had seized the Emporia, a strip of particularly fertile coastal farmland that had been Carthaginian territory for centuries and whose revenues had funded the city for generations. Carthage appealed to Rome. Rome delayed, as it always did, and ruled ambiguously, as it always did, in Massinissa's general direction. Exhausted by decades of legal dispossession and with its last productive farmland being absorbed by the Numidian kingdom, Carthage made the decision that its treaty absolutely forbade. It raised an army, around 30,000 men, and marched against Massinissa without Rome's permission. Yet the Numidian cavalry destroyed it completely. The army that Carthage had spent its last financial reserves to equip was gone in a single engagement. In the Roman Senate, the news was received not with alarm, but with relief. Carthage had broken the treaty. The casus belli existed. Cato was not alive to see it. He died in 149 BC, the year Rome declared war. But he had spoken the outcome into existence over 6 years of relentless repetition. The senators who had resisted him for years found, in the wreckage of Carthage's army and the broken clause of the peace treaty, the cover they needed to do what many of them had wanted to do since Zama. They voted for war. Rome prepared its legions, and the fleet that Carthage had surrendered and watched burn in its own harbor 45 years earlier would now be answered by Rome's ships on the horizon of the Bay of Tunis. Carthage heard what was coming and did something that was either an act of extraordinary courage or of complete political desperation. It may have been both simultaneously. It sent envoys to Rome offering unconditional surrender before a single Roman soldier had landed in Africa. The Senate accepted the surrender and issued its initial demands: 300 noble Carthaginian children to be delivered as hostages to Rome, and total disarmament, every sword, every spear, every piece of armor, every catapult and siege engine and javelin in the city to be brought to the Roman camp and handed over. Carthage complied with both demands. The hostages were sent. 200,000 sets of armor and 2,000 catapults were transported to the Roman general's tent on the shore. And then Rome stated its final condition: the city itself would be demolished, and the population would relocate at least 15 kilometers inland, away from the sea. They had surrendered everything and kept nothing, and it had bought them nothing at all. When the Carthaginian envoys returned from the Roman camp in 149 BC and reported the final condition, that the city must be abandoned, demolished, and rebuilt 15 kilometers from the sea, the reaction of the people spread from the Senate House to the marketplace to the harbor within hours. The grief was immediate and total. Men and women tore their clothes in the streets. People collapsed at the news and could not rise. And senators wept openly on the steps of the council house. It was not the demand for territory, not the loss of land or ships or silver that broke them. It was the word demolished. The temples where their grandparents had left offerings, the streets where their children had learned to walk, the harbor where every ship that had ever left for somewhere better had also returned. Carthage was not just where they lived, it was what they were. The city sealed its gates and began to prepare. What followed was one of the most remarkable acts of collective defiance in the ancient world. Carthage had already surrendered every weapon it possessed, 200,000 sets of armor, 2,000 artillery pieces, the entire contents of its military arsenal, delivered in good faith to the Roman camp on the shore. It now had to rebuild a war-making capacity from nothing, using only what its people and its workshops could produce. The temples and open spaces of the city were converted into workshops overnight. Citizens who had never carried a sword spent their days casting javelin heads and shield bosses. Women cut their hair and twisted it into bowstrings for catapults because no other fiber of sufficient length and strength was available. Each day, the workshops produced 100 shields, 300 swords, and 500 javelins. They worked in shifts around the clock. The Romans had expected a swift capitulation. Instead, 2 years of siege followed in which the initial Roman commanders achieved almost nothing. The triple walls absorbed everything thrown at them. Swift Carthaginian sailors ran the naval blockade at night, was slipping food and supplies into the harbor past the Roman fleet. When the Romans finally breached a section of wall in 149 BC and poured men through the gap, the defenders had fortified every street and every house behind it. The Romans found themselves fighting not for a city, but through one, room by room, staircase by staircase, the defenders yielding each floor only after it had been won in hand-to-hand combat. They were driven back out. In 147 BC, the Roman Senate, frustrated by the failure of 2 consecutive commanders, set aside its normal age requirements and appointed a 36-year-old officer as supreme commander in Africa. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, and he was the adopted grandson of the man who had beaten Hannibal at Zama 40 years earlier. He arrived at Carthage and immediately imposed the discipline that had been lacking. He dismissed officers he considered inadequate. He tightened the siege lines. He ordered the construction of a massive stone mole across the mouth of the harbor, sealing it completely against any further resupply by sea. Carthage, watching the stone structure grow across its waterway, responded by secretly cutting a new channel through the southern side of its harbor complex. An engineering feat of considerable scale completed in weeks, and launched its rebuilt fleet through the new opening. The Romans were stunned to see warships in water they had believed sealed. The advantage was brief. In the engagement that followed, the Carthaginian ships suffered heavy losses through a mismanaged withdrawal. By the spring of 146 BC, the city was starving. The mole had held. The new channel was blocked. No food had entered for months. Scipio launched his final assault from the harbor side, breaching the walls in force, and this time the Romans did not stop. They drove into the commercial port, through the market quarter, up toward the Bursa hill. The Carthaginians retreated up the narrow streets of the citadel, fighting from rooftops and windows, pulling stairs up behind them, collapsing floors onto the men below. Scipio set soldiers to work in rotating shifts, 6 hours fighting, 6 hours resting, so that the killing never slowed. He was methodical, and he was merciless, and he was thorough. The city burned as it fell, district by district, the fires spreading through the tightly packed residential quarters and sending columns of smoke visible from 50 kilometers out to sea. Yet the killing went on for 6 days, the streets filled with the dead, and the Roman advance slowed not from resistance, but because the fallen had to be physically cleared from the road before the soldiers could continue forward. 60,000 people died in those 6 days, killed by Roman soldiers working their way through every building in the city with orders to leave nothing alive behind them. On the 7th day, Scipio ordered prisoners to be taken. 50,000 survivors were rounded up, marched to the shore, and sold into slavery. They were dispersed to buyers across the Roman world, Greece, Italy, Spain, Egypt, separated from their families, scattered so thoroughly that no coherent Carthaginian community could ever reconstitute itself from the wreckage. The Carthaginian general Hasdrubal, now who had commanded the city's defense through 3 years of siege, surrendered personally to Scipio on the final day. His wife had remained on the Bursa hill, in the last temple still standing, the great temple of Eshmun that had crowned the citadel for centuries. When she saw her husband walk out to the Romans, she appeared on the roof of the temple. She said to Scipio, in full view and full hearing of both armies, that the gods had no cause for anger with him. He was a Roman general exercising the rights of war, and she did not reproach him. She reserved her words for her husband, who had surrendered when she had not. Then, with her children beside her, she perished in the fire she had lit in the temple at her feet. The temple burned with her inside it. 900 Roman deserters, who had fought alongside the Carthaginians and knew what Roman justice held in store for them, burned with her too, refusing to surrender. The temple fire was the last resistance the city made. Scipio stood in the ruins and watched the city burn. The Greek historian Polybius, who had accompanied him throughout the entire campaign and was present at his side in that moment, recorded what the Roman general said as the flames consumed the last district of Carthage. Scipio turned to him, took his hand, and told him that he felt a foreboding, that one day the same fate would be pronounced on Rome itself. Then he stood in silence and recited lines from the Iliad, the prophecy that Troy would fall, that its people would be scattered, that the city which had stood for generations would be turned to rubble and ash. He was 37 years old, and he had just destroyed the greatest city in the Western Mediterranean, and he was weeping. The Roman Senate sent a commission of 10 senators to supervise the demolition. The walls were torn down systematically. The harbor was filled with rubble. The great residential districts were pulled apart stone by stone, the building materials loaded onto carts and distributed to allied cities in North Africa as construction material. Anything of value was shipped to Rome: gold fittings from the temples, bronze statuary, items of obvious wealth and craftsmanship. The site was cursed formally, the curse inscribed on stone. No one was to rebuild here, no settlement was to be planted on this ground. The Bursa hill, where Elissa had once laid strips of oxhide in the red dirt and claimed a city from nothing, was left open to the sky. The goats grazed on the hill where the temple of Eshmun had stood. The libraries were dealt with separately. Carthage had accumulated 6 centuries of written records, histories, religious texts, agricultural manuals, navigational accounts, legal archives, commercial records, diplomatic correspondence. All of it existed somewhere in the city's temples and archives when the Romans entered. The Roman Senate made a single exception. The 28 volumes of Mago's agricultural handbook were taken to Rome and translated into Latin on the Senate's specific order. They were distributed to farmers across Italy, and Roman agronomists cited them as the authoritative text on estate management for the next 2 centuries. Mago's name entered Latin literature attached to his practical knowledge, while everything else he might have written was lost. And the rest of the library, the histories, the mythologies, the navigation records, the chronicles of the Tofet, the accounts of Hanno's voyage and every voyage since, was given to the Berber kings of North Africa who had been Roman allies. It was scattered into their private libraries, where over the following centuries it fell apart, was lost, or burned in fires of its own. What this meant in practice was that Carthage ceased to speak for itself from the moment its city fell. The history of the Phoenicians and Carthaginians that survived into the ancient world was the history written by Greeks and Romans, the people who had competed with them, feared them, fought them, and ultimately destroyed them. Carthaginian faithlessness became a Latin idiom, punica fides, Punic faith, meaning treachery of the most complete kind. The word Punic, which had simply meant Phoenician, was loaded with centuries of Roman hostility until it carried the weight of everything Rome wished to believe about the people it had fought for 100 years. The child sacrifice, the mercenary armies, the commercial cunning, the cruelty. These became the fixed image of Carthage, uncorrected by any Carthaginian voice, because every Carthaginian voice had been burned. A century after the destruction, Julius Caesar walked across the abandoned site and decided it should be settled again. The colony that was eventually established there by Augustus grew quickly, drawing on the same advantages of geography and position that had made the first city great. Roman Carthage became one of the largest cities in the empire, the capital of the province of Africa, a major center of learning and commerce, the city where the Christian theologian Augustine would be educated in the 4th century AD. The new city was built directly on top of the ruins of the old, the Roman foundations pressing down through the ash layer, that 60-centimeter band of black charcoal and carbonized debris that archaeologists still find running through the stratigraphy of the Bursa Hill, and into the Punic levels below. The old city became the foundation of the new one, literally and invisibly. What Rome could not fully erase were the things that had already spread too far to be gathered back. The Phoenician alphabet had been in Greek hands since the 9th century BC, and the Romans had it from the Greeks via the Etruscans. It was already their own, and the agricultural techniques Mago had written down were now embedded in Italian farming practice. The mortise and tenon shipbuilding method the Romans called Punic joinery was in every shipyard in the Mediterranean. Maritime insurance, interest-bearing trade loans, standardized commercial contracts. These instruments had been circulating through the trading networks of the ancient world for so long that no one any longer knew to attribute them to Carthage. They were simply how commerce worked. The civilization that Rome declared an enemy of civilization had already given that civilization its most durable tools, and there was nothing Rome could do about it. The story of Carthage is not, in the end, a story about destruction. Destruction was the last chapter, and last chapters do not define what a story means. And it is a story about what a people can build when geography forces them onto the water, and the water forces them to be clever. When the mountains are behind you, and the sea is in front of you, and the only way forward is on the back of a ship. It is a story about an alphabet made by merchants for merchants that became the foundation of every literate civilization in the Western world. It is a story about a commercial model so effective that even the empire that smashed it to rubble quietly adopted everything it had produced. Carthage was erased because it had already won the argument it was making. Its alphabet is the one you are using to read these words. Its commercial logic is the one that moves goods across every ocean on earth. Its city is ash and goat pasture on a hill in Tunisia. Everything else it made is still here. In the spring of 146 BC, as the last fires on the Bursa Hill burned themselves out, and the smoke drifted southeast across the Bay of Tunis toward the open sea, the gulls that had circled the harbor for 6 centuries settled again on the ruined quays. The water in the Carthaginian was still. The columns of the Admiral's Tower leaned at an angle in the rubble. The streets were empty. The city that had sent ships to the edge of the world, that had kept Rome awake at night for 100 years, that had made the alphabet and the contract and the mortgage and the maritime insurance policy. That city was over. What it had made was not.